Okay, hello everyone and welcome. I'm James Shaheen, Tricycle's editor. We're joined today by Stephen Batchelor. Stephen is a translator, teacher, artist, and writer known for his secular approach to Dharma. He's a co-founder of Bodhi College, and his books include Buddhism Without Beliefs, Living with the Devil, Confession of a Buddhist Atheist, and After Buddhism. His most recent book, The Art of Solitude, was published by Yale University Press last year. Stephen is also a longtime friend and a longtime contributor to Tricycle. Stephen will be leading an online course, After Buddhism and Beyond, from February 13th through June 26th. It will be offered by Bodhi College. We've provided a link to it in the chat. I'll start our discussion with some questions for Stephen, and then we'll invite you to ask your own questions. You can post your question in the Zoom Q&A panel using the button below the video screen. A recording of this event will be available on Tricycle's YouTube channel afterward. So Stephen, hi, how are you?
Hello, James. I'm fine. I'm at home in France, locked down because of the pandemic, of course. And I'm having a good time. I'm writing, meditating, reading a lot. Reading a huge amount at the moment. And
what are you reading?
I'm reading Plato. I'm completely absorbed in trying to figure out who Socrates was. Mm-hmm. And this has led me to rather belatedly start reading seriously the Platonic dialogues, as well as a lot of related materials, Xenophon, which gives another take on who Socrates was. And I'm also reading the tragedians, Euripides, Sophocles, to try to get a sense of the tragedies that Socrates himself would have seen in Athens in the 5th century BC, and so we go on.
So how is this going to come into the seminar? I call it a seminar because I understand it's going to be very interactive. Will this
material?
This material.
Well, I hope so. You see, I'm working on a book called An Ethics of Uncertainty. And this is a kind of a sequel to my book I published a few years ago called After Buddhism. And the seminar, the seminars that'll be happening from February through to June, After Buddhism and Beyond, really is an opportunity for me to explore not only the material that is already published in After Buddhism and to look at that more carefully, maybe critically, to give people a clearer sense of where I'm coming from in relation to the Buddhist tradition, and in many ways leaving a lot of traditional Buddhism behind. And in the Ethics of Uncertainty, I take this, into yet a further iteration, one of which is to compare the figures of Socrates and Gautama. And it's remarkable, I think, that these two men lived at exactly the same time. They both lived in the 5th century BC, from about 480 to 400. And I think there are striking parallels between Socrates, and again, we must distinguish between Socrates and Plato, but the figure of Socrates, to the extent to which we can tease him apart from the metaphysician and philosopher Plato, I feel has some quite striking parallels with Gautama. And the most striking parallel, and the one that brings him into this book, as you've been asking, is that I think both of them taught an ethics of uncertainty. Socrates is well known in Western tradition as the first moral philosopher, the first philosopher who thought that what really mattered was not what is the nature of the world and what is the nature of reality. These were ideas that he left behind and focused entirely on the question of how do you lead a good life. And I think you could make a similar case for the Buddha, someone who refuses to get involved in metaphysical questions and focuses really on how you live a good life. So these and other parallels, and there's lots, are really what are going to be the focus of this part of the book that looks at Socrates. And I hope I will have enough material written by May or June to be able to bring these ideas into the seminars themselves. I very much hope so, but I'm not going to promise anything right now.
Well, you were kind enough to send me the first 40,000 words of the initial draft of the book that you're working on, and I actually did read it. And so I read all of it. Yes, I did. So I wanted to begin with the ethics of uncertainty. It's something that is further developed from before Buddhism. I mean, it's definitely a continuing theme. And I just want to read you something that you wrote, and then you can riff off that. You write, in avoiding absolutes, the practice of the middle way embodies an ethics of uncertainty and risk. For as I weave my way through my life, I keep finding myself in situations which call for a response, but for which I lack the ideological or religious convictions that would tell me what to do. So why don't you talk about the ethics of uncertainty? What does that mean?
Well, if I could say that in a few sentences, I wouldn't have had to write the book.
Well, you can help us out, though.
But no, the passage you quote is, funnily enough, one I was looking at today, and I think it does summarize quite well the challenge to lead an ethical life, but without having some philosophy, let's say metaphysical beliefs, be they Buddhist or Christian or other, that will give us a kind of a bedrock, a foundation on which we can have the confidence to know that, this is the way to act in this situation. These are the things that are good. These are the things that are not good. And I think you see, although Buddhism, of course, with its doctrines of karma and its ideas of what mental states are wholesome, what are unwholesome, and so on, actually gives you a lot of support. But there are many other passages, particularly in the early discourses, where the Buddha actually is very suspicious of any claims to have kind of certainty about the way the world works, for example. He in the Kalama Sutta, again, a very well-known Pali text, he says, well, if there is a law of karmic cause and effect, then these practices will be of great benefit to you. And if there is no law of karmic cause and effect, these practices will be of great benefit to you. If there is a future life, then this will be a great thing to do. If there's not a future life. And you find Socrates saying very similar things. And what this points to, therefore, is that if we discard the kind of metaphysics and the cosmology and the law of karma and all of those things in Buddhism, what are we left with as a foundation for ethics? How do we, live a life in which we, let's say through the practice of mindfulness, through the practice of awareness, of loving kindness, of compassion, we're basically opening ourselves to the suffering of the world. We're opening ourselves to our own, conflicts and difficulties and pains, and we're opening ourselves to the suffering we encounter with other people in societies, and nowadays we might even say in the global situation too. So we become more sensitized to suffering, to dukkha, but we're then called upon, and I think in a way we cannot but feel we have to respond to this suffering. We have to do something about it. We can't just sort of let it hang. So where does the moral impulse, the ethical vision come from? And that's the question I seek to explore. And I will argue that an ethics of uncertainty is one that is actually totally open to the fact that we don't know what to do with any certainty. It's very convenient to have a whole list of precepts, don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other. And because that gives us the sense that if we just keep the precepts, we'll be okay. But if we don't have that confidence, then where does the source of that response come from? And what this leads to, I think, is an ethics of risk. In other words, one seeks to understand the situation of suffering before one, as best one can, One tries to get as much information. One tries to have as clear and calm a mind to assess the situation that you are going to respond to. But you can never be certain that what you say or do is going to make things better. One can hope so. One can passionately long to improve the status of the world, but that's tricky. We don't have sufficient evidence to guarantee that what we do will be the right thing. We might actually, with the very best intentions, with all the bodhicitta in the world, and we still end up making things worse. And so you have to accept that as a condition for ethical behavior. And in that respect, ethics requires courage, and it requires the ability to take risks, and it also requires the humility not to think that because you're a Buddhist or because you've had certain meditative insights, you'll get it right. In fact, that leads to a constant reflection, a constant dialectic of ethical reflection, seeing what the consequences of your actions are, noticing what happens on yourself, on others, and learning as best you can from that. And I think the developing of a kind of inner ethical compass or moral sense or sense of conscience is something we train ourselves to do, something we learn through life itself, not from studying ancient texts. They might help, but the actual cut and thrust of ethical life is, I think, learned through living as an ethical agent in the kind of world we live in now.
You know, along those lines, you emphasize what ought one do rather than what things are. And so you tend in your translations to turn nouns into verbs or lean in favor of verbs. And I just wanted to take a few things that you translate in a way that may be jarring for some, but for which there is a rationale. For instance, you call the Four Noble Truths, the Four Tasks, and emphasize action through them rather than some ontological pronouncement of what things are. So can you talk a little bit about why you would call them the Four Tasks? And I have another translation for you after that.
Okay. Well, this is a long story and something that I will look at in considerable detail in the seminars themselves. But really, all of my work in the last 20 or so years has turned on this distinction. In other words, leaving behind the Four Noble Truths, and by implication, any truth claims, and certainly I leave behind relative truth and ultimate truth. Relative truth, ultimate truth, you simply don't find in the Buddha's discourses. And there is evidence that the Four Noble Truths too was something that was somehow put together at some later point. We don't exactly know when, and we don't know by who. Certainly the doctrine of the Four Noble Truths runs right through the early Pali Canon, and it was clearly very central to early Buddhism. But I would argue that we can either think of an alternative, which is a way of looking at these truths in terms of tasks, or simply by leaving the truths out of the story altogether and just starting with these four tasks. The first discourse of the Buddha, Turning the Wheel of Dharma, states very, very clearly, absolutely explicitly, that awakening, this is how the text concludes. The Buddha says, "It was not until my knowledge and vision was entirely clear about how to recognize and practice and master these four tasks: embracing suffering, letting go of reactivity, seeing it stopping, and cultivating a way of life. I could not consider myself to be fully awake." He doesn't say it was only when I understood the Four Noble Truths. In other words, his awakening, I will argue, is actually not based upon his having gained some perfect insight into the nature of reality or truth, which is how all religions, in a sense, need to feel they need to ground themselves in. but actually his awakening was the result of his having learned to live differently in the world through his thoughts and his words and his acts, and thereby establishing, in my way of thinking at least, a way of looking at the Dharma in which we have no need any longer to make such kind of truth claims, but instead we're provided with a framework, an ethical framework, which hopefully can help guide us in how we actually live in the world, both in terms of our own personal flourishing as a person, in terms of how we create and develop communities, and in terms of how we respond to the kinds of crises that the world presents with us in this day and age.
You know, just a little bit more on the Four Noble Truths. I hope I read this correctly. I didn't have a lot of time, but I did read it. You mentioned that once a person through action embodies or connects with the Four Noble Truths, then follows the Eightfold Path, and you asked yourself at some point, why that order? Why would the Eightfold Path follow? Do you want to say something about that?
Well, yes, this is in a way what a question that occurred to me many, many years ago when I first started studying Buddhism in Dharamsala with Tibetan lamas. It always struck me as strange that the Four Noble Truths were arranged in the sequence they were. You have suffering, and then you have the cause of suffering, and then you have the cessation of suffering, and then you have the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. It struck me as clumsy, and also it struck me as, I don't know, it wasn't economic and beautiful. It didn't have an aesthetic feel to it. Now, Buddhist tradition, and this includes Tibetans and Theravadins and others, will explain the sequence of the Four Noble Truths according to a medical analogy. In other words, first you need to recognize that you're sick, then you need to find out what is the cause of that sickness, then you need to be convinced that there's a way of curing this sickness, and then you need to follow a therapy or a treatment that will lead to that cure. And that's a model I think you'll find in all societies, Buddhist or otherwise. It makes perfect sense. But what's curious is that although the Buddha frequently compares his teaching to a medicine, compares himself to a doctor, there's nowhere in the Pali Canon in which he gives that explanation, in which you find that medical analogy for the Four Truths. I find that kind of odd. But what, in a way, after many, many years of thinking about this, why are they arranged in this sequence? I discovered that if instead of thinking of the truths, you think of the tasks that are connected to the truths, then you can see very clearly why they're arranged in that sequence, because that's the way the tasks work. Embracing life or embracing suffering becomes the condition for letting go of reactive patterns of craving and so on. Letting go of craving, second task, becomes the precondition for seeing the stopping of craving, third task. And the stopping of reactivity is effectively equivalent to samadhi, there's a sort of the appropriate perspective on life, which is the beginning of the fourth task. And so in terms of tasks, you discover a simplicity, an economy, and I think a certain beauty to the organization of these ideas, which points much more closely to the principle of dependent origination or conditioned arising, which is supposed to be one of the key insights of the Buddha's awakening, which comes down to when this is, that arises. When this is not, that does not arise. And that works very neatly in, when there is the embracing of suffering, then the grasping and the reactivity will not be fed, will not be, in a sense, developed, or less likely to be developed, and so on and so forth. So you have the task model then also begins to make more sense, because then the sequence makes more sense. You can see why they're arranged in that way, because they're basically cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect, rather than effect, cause, effect, cause. Now, this is also something that I'm going to be exploring in the seminars, particularly by my revisiting, as you'll find in the chapter 6 of the text you read, the very last bit, is that I recognize now that one of the keys to arriving at this model of 4 tasks was actually through my study of the path as taught in traditional Tibetan Buddhism, where they speak, and anyone who has a Tibetan Buddhist background will be aware of this. They talk of the 5 paths, the path of accumulation, of preparation, of seeing, and of meditation is how they're usually translated. I can't go into this now, but basically I think that those 5 paths are a somewhat garbled version of the 4 tasks. And I think it's by having trained as a Tibetan Buddhist monk to think of the path in that logical sequence that, in a sense, allowed me quite naturally to see the same logical development within the tasks, and thereby to get a better sense of what might there have been at the origin of the Buddhist teaching, which I feel to have been more a series of paths rather than truths. So I'm now going to start speaking in terms of the 4 paths as opposed to the 4 truths. I think that is, if there, I think that's a more appropriate language. And I think the Theravada tradition, for some reason, lost this doctrine of the 5 paths or 4 paths, whereas it was preserved in the Savastivada school in North India in a Sanskrit version. And that's the one that found its way into Tibet. And so paradoxically, despite all of my critical ideas about Tibetan Buddhism, if I'm really honest with myself, I can see that it's within the Tibetan tradition that I actually found one of the most important keys to arriving at this understanding of the 4 tasks.
Well, for those familiar with the 5 paths in Tibetan Buddhism, the 5th is no more learning, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Translated, and that is basically, in other words, it's been completed. So you're left really with 4 paths.
Well, that's the point. Yeah, it's a bit strange to talk of 5 paths when the 5th path is actually where you're going to end up. It's the end. It's the end of the path. It's the goal. It's when you become an arhat or a Buddha. It's strange to speak of that as a path. So if you politely put that to one side, then what you're left with is 4 paths. And the overlaps between the paths and the tasks is really quite striking, particularly when you get to the 3rd and the 4th, they're effectively using the same words. What's also extraordinarily valuable is that when the Tibetans, and well, really it's not the Tibetans, it's the Savastivadins and other Indians who were developing these ideas before they came to Tibet. But they then map onto these 4 paths the 32 factors of awakening, or 37 as they're usually called, but really there are just 32. And once you map those 32 factors onto the 4 paths, you can then actually enrich your understanding of the 4 tasks, because if they are parallel, which I think they are, then that fleshes out what each of the 4 tasks entails. And it provides you with a very, very rich set of materials, the 32 factors of awakening, that can then, I think, bring the tasks into a much greater granularity, and also to provide a much more 3-dimensional framework for how to understand them.
When I was reading all of that and how it all comes together, I thought there's quite a bit of detective work going on there. It's impressive. So what other, to take one more word that you translate, you lay out the Eightfold Path in a different order than we're used to seeing it. I don't know if that is particularly significant, but I just would like to ask about one way in which you translate one limb, as you referred to. You translate what we ordinarily hear referred to as right speech as voice. And again, there's a process here, as in finding one's voice. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes. I think, this is a work in progress, and the vocabulary I'm using right now may not stay. I'm constantly reworking and rethinking trying to find the most appropriate ways in English to express these ideas. That's not easy. And it's an endless, process of trial and error, learning from other people's translations and so on. But there are actually three terms in my rendition of the Eightfold Path that are translated in a very non-conventional way. Rather than speech, I prefer voice. Now, one reason for that is purely etymological. The Sanskrit or Pali word for voice is vacha, and that's a cognate of the Latin vox, or vocal, vocation. And so, in other words, it's closer in its literal sense, its etymological sense, to voice rather than speech. And as a writer, and also as someone who is trying to bring imagination and creativity into this process, which is another area that this book explores, is that it allows us to think of right speech, or what I would prefer to call here now like a kind of a true voice, as the process of finding your own voice. It's not about avoiding speech that is, that is untrue or unkind or harsh or chattery, which is the standard view. It's actually recognizing that the development of your voice as a thinker, as a writer, as a speaker, has to do with actually differentiating your own insights and understandings from those of others. And I feel that if the process of the Eightfold Path is one in which we become less and less dependent on others, which is again how the Buddha described it, the person who's entered the stream of the path becomes independent of others in the practice, becomes autonomous, then I think that supports the idea of thinking of sama vacha, complete speech or voice, as very much about refining your own articulation in words and images and other forms of art, let's say, in a way that it reflects more and more the distinctiveness of your own understanding and the way you can come to express it.
I have so many more questions I'd ask you about using the word imagination, for instance, but we do want our listeners to be able to ask questions. I just wanted to point out one thing about this seminar. One thing that I'm interested in doing when I join the seminar is listen to you think this through and participate in the process of fleshing all of this out. I think that is very inviting, to watch the process and be a part of it, because I can see that the book will have more iterations. I read an early partial draft. So thank you for sharing that with us. So the audience questions, the first one is, does an ethics of uncertainty have political implications in your experience and analysis?
Political implications.
Does
yes. You don't have to use the word uncertainty. You could say ethics has political implications. It's necessarily the case. The fact that that question is asked implies that there's there is an assumption, perhaps, that the practice of the Dharma is basically about the transformation of the mind. And Buddhism is very good at that, clearly. But if we go back to the first task is dukkha parinya. It's about embracing the totality of life, all life situations, both very intimate life situations, how you feel inside yourself, your own psychological stuff. We say yes to that, we embrace that, we recognize that, but it extends to the to global situations. It extends to the kind of economy that we live in. It extends to social injustices in our society, and thereby it leads us necessarily into politics. And in a democratic society, that has to do with who we choose to vote for, which particular body of politicians we want to be running the country. And so I think if you start with tasks rather than truths, you're already engaged. You don't have to sort of add on the word engaged to Buddhism to flag that you can also practice your Buddhism in an engaged way. that already kind of gives the game away. That the fact that we have to add that adjective engaged suggests that for many Buddhists, Buddhism is not engaged. It's something we can make into an engaged practice. I'm arguing that if we start with 4 tasks, and the first of which is to embrace the suffering of life in its totality, we're already embarking on a process of engagement, of how we let go of what hinders us, not because reactivity causes suffering, which is the standard truth model, but the real problem with craving, grasping, all those negative states of mind is that they block us, they obstruct us from being able to enter the stream of a path in which we are learning to live from another perspective altogether. The perspective of non-reactivity, this perspective of openness, of compassion, of emptiness. And the reason for emptiness is to empty the mind of what gets in the way of being able to respond appropriately and wisely and kindly to the situations at hand. I'm arguing that the Dharma is nothing but ethics. We don't need a metaphysical background. And again, here we find a commonality with Socrates. You don't need to know anything about the nature of the world. What matters is your encounter with suffering, how you respond to it, and how you do so as an ethical being with a vision of the kind of person you seek to be and the kind of world you seek to bring into being for a society or a community or even a planet. So once you drop the truths and focus on the paths or the tasks, you're already engaged. And that extends definitely to the political realm. This doesn't mean that Buddhism will argue for, for democracy or for Chinese state communism or whatever, as a kind of a doctrine, but it will open up a space in which we're challenged to respond to the suffering of the world as best we can in terms of our traditions, our instincts, our values, and that will lead us to make political choices.
All right, here's a rather long question. Some secular Buddhists, at least that I encounter in social media groups, fully reject karma and rebirth, sometimes with outright aversion. Is this approach consistent with Buddhism in any definition, or should we at least maintain a humble agnosticism on these points? And then they add, if we understand, not just believe in the law of karma, whether from physics or from metaphysics, it appears to me that ethics does have a foundation in certainty and not uncertainty. Well, that's a separate but related question.
Okay. I feel that to have an aversion or even a downright hatred of certain doctrines is not compatible with Buddhism. It seems to be that's part of the problem. It's not that, if you really can't stand a particular way of looking at the world, you're caught up in an aversive reaction. And it's true, I do come across this. I find people who've got a very dogmatic position on rebirth and karma, sometimes perhaps having come through a very traditional Buddhist approach and having struggled for a long time perhaps to really understand these ideas. And it's getting to a point where you just say, I just can't handle this. And that then, you read a book by Stephen Batchelor, let's say, and you end up thinking, oh, yippee, I don't have to believe all that stuff anymore. And that then can easily fuel a kind of a very critical, negative rejection of these ideas. And that is not what I feel is appropriate. I mean, it's this agnostic position, and you say a humble agnosticism, and I would agree with that. I think on the questions of karma, rebirth, for me, the most sane way to deal with them is to be honest. And that's basically to say, I don't know. It could be that there is a law of karma undergirding the structure of reality. I don't know. I can't say there's not, any more than I could say that God does not exist. I cannot prove that. I cannot claim that. I just find the idea of God not particularly helpful, as I find the idea of karmic cause and effect not particularly helpful. And rebirth, again, I think many people who see the world in the framework of evolutionary biology and other such disciplines find it very difficult to fit in a kind of reincarnating consciousness. But that doesn't mean that therefore it's wrong or false or couldn't have a meaning which is maybe more symbolic. All of that is possible. But personally, I would argue that you can have a full practice of the Dharma, which engages all parts of your humanity and without any reference or any need to believe in the traditional doctrines of karma and rebirth. Karma and rebirth doctrines are largely a vestige, a legacy of Indian cosmology, ancient Indian cosmology. There are people in the West. University of Virginia has a department that looks into young children's claims to remember past lives, and there's very interesting material there. So certainly, I think that these questions, it's silly to rule these ideas, out of bounds, and it's particularly unhelpful to reject them. But it's also important, I think, to ask ourselves, well, what does it really mean to live in an agnostic life? Uncertainty is basically the condition of agnosticism. Agnosticism means I don't know. In other words, I'm not certain about anything. I cannot have certainty about these things. So yes, a humble agnosticism. And if through whatever means, be it through physics or further developments and understandings in cognitive science or whatever it is, brings to light the fact there is a reincarnating consciousness, then that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. And it might in fact be the case. I personally doubt it, but I honestly don't know. But I feel that, anyway, that's enough of that.
No, I was just going to say, in other words, you're not going to spend your time trying to determine what's true. You're going to think about what ought you do.
Yeah, exactly. This is the whole problem, I think, is that Buddhism is so invested in doctrines like karma and rebirth that a huge amount of mental time and energy is spent trying to figure them out. Or I remember as a young Buddhist monk struggling very hard to persuade myself that they were true, and using as much evidence as I could garner. My Tibetan Buddhist training in the Gelugpa school involved the practice of logic and reason in order to be able to arrive at certainty about reincarnation, for example. But once I did, in fact, look at the arguments and study them, they basically didn't work. And they didn't work in the terms of Tibetan Buddhist logic itself. They didn't work. They didn't meet the criteria of what's called a valid syllogistic argument. So in other words, it's an act of faith. But the point is, in these seminars, I'm not going to be going into this material in any particular detail or depth. But on the other hand, I hope these seminars will be interactive. And if these kinds of questions become the ones that are clearly on people's minds and they want to explore them further, we'll explore them further.
Okay, the next question. You spoke about leaving Buddhism behind today and in your book. In the Art of Solitude, you wrote about purging your attachment to Buddhism. Do you believe this is a necessary step on the spiritual path and in fully awakening?
No. I mean, that would, again, be to take one person's limited experience as the basis for constructing some doctrine or some kind of theory as to how things should be. No, each of us will have our own path. And going back to what James was asking about before, finding one's own voice, finding one's own way. I think one of the features of a secular Dharma in the framework that I'm exploring it is to be less committed to these kind of classical models of the path to enlightenment. In other words, you follow step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and at the end of the day, bingo, you are a Buddha. I don't think such ways of thinking are helpful beyond providing a very broad sort of map of the processes that we're talking about. In the kind of individuated society and culture in which we live, I feel it's more and more the case for each practitioner to become autonomous in their own practice, to find their own voice, and to, in a way, lessen their hold on the certainties of Buddhist orthodoxy. And it's true, I have to acknowledge that my whole adult life for the past nearly 50 years now has been deeply involved with the Buddhist tradition. And I've also noticed that I have lots of deep layers of attachment to that tradition, some of which are perhaps perfectly healthy, others of which I think are still a kind of need to hold on to something that can give me some kind of self-validation as the Buddhist, the secular Buddhist, or whatever. That kind of self-identification, the attachment to views and opinions, that I think is a problem. Whether, and that can be just as much with regard to Buddhism or any kind of religious belief as anything else. I think the relationship we have to ideas, the relationship we have to our religions and our traditions, that is what I'm really concerned with. Can we hold these traditions more lightly? Can we engage with these traditions in a way in which they enable us to become more fully the kind of people we can be? Or do they kind of lock us into a fixed model of the ideal human being, and we struggle to somehow conform to the kind of ideal that the tradition seems to hold up of the perfect Buddhist student? That's a problem because we're locked into somebody else's view.
Okay, next question. Given the reality of uncertainty and of our necessarily subjective perception, what benefits of a Buddhist identity do you personally see? Is going for refuge still a bedrock for your experience?
I think the idea of going for refuge is very central. Whether I call it a bedrock, I'm not sure, but it is a central dimension of Dharma practice. And again, the entering of the stream of the path, the fourth task, is defined by the Buddha as gaining lucid confidence in the Buddha, in the Dharma and the Sangha. But by Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, we don't mean the historical Buddha. We don't mean the Dharma as a particular Buddhist orthodoxy, and we don't mean by Sangha a particular community of monks or nuns. Those are manifestations of those principles that were very much present in Asian Buddhism, but we need to dig a little bit deeper to see that Buddha is really a way of understanding a state of being awake, in a way that our humanity is somehow optimized. Our mind is brought to its fullest capacity. And the Dharma, not to be seen as a group of practices, but rather as the way itself, the path that enables us to become more awake. And the Sangha has nothing to do with, in my estimation, belonging to a particular organization. It has to do with a life that is nurtured by certain key friendships and connections with others. It doesn't have to be that many people, but you do, I think, need to have a practice in which you are part of a community, a shared gathering of others that are able to support each other in their own processes of individuation. But I struggle with the business of identifying as a Buddhist. I really do. At some level, simply to be honest, I have to acknowledge when I'm in public situations that I spent my life as a practicing Buddhist. If I were in a hospital and had to fill in a form that says religion, I'd tick Buddhism. But in many situations, particularly when I'm interacting with people who are not Buddhist or even interested in Buddhism, I find that identifying as a Buddhist can actually get seriously in the way. In fact, sometimes I really feel quite, I almost dread the idea that the word Buddhism will come up and then the conversation will go, oh, do you know the Dalai Lama? Or what do you think? Or are you going to be reborn? And I get, and that to me is so far from what I'm actually, really concerned with, that it seems to be a diversion or a distraction. And in some ways, for that reason, I find it helpful at times to let go of that identity and to think of myself really as just a practitioner of the Dharma. But then when you use the Dharma word, that too is problematic. People don't know what it means, and off you go again.
You mentioned monks and nuns. Just quickly, where do you see them in all of this? For instance, as in the secular Buddhist movement, what about monks and nuns?
Well, funnily enough, I've recently had two Buddhist monks contact me who think of themselves as secular monks. One is in the Tibetan tradition, the other is actually a Theravada, American Theravada monk I've just got in contact with, and he's very much interested in my work, and yet he wants to live as a bhikkhu in the West. And I'm trying to help support him in that, as with the other fellow. I have no problem with this at all. I think there are people, and perhaps I'm one of them in a way, who feel a certain calling to that way of life, a vocation, as the Christians would call it. And I think if a person does feel that they want to lead that sort of renunciant life, I would certainly encourage it. I would even encourage them to go to Asia and really experience it in a traditional monastery. I gained a great deal from that. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now had I not had a monastic training over 10 years. I can't imagine that's possible. Where I have difficulty is when communities of monks or nuns, and usually it's monks, claim to have the authority of being the standard bearers of Buddhism, that they are the authority. And they claim that the Dharma is only truly preserved in these monastic organizations, and that the society needs to defer to monastic authority on questions of doctrine, on questions of ethics, on questions of all kinds of things, and that the lay community is somehow subordinate in a social sense, in a religious sense, in a political sense, in an economic sense, to the groups of monks and nuns who have, and we must admit this, been those who have kept Buddhism going. If there hadn't been monasteries and these communities, I find it very difficult, given the historical conditions in Asia, that Buddhism would even be sitting here now, if it weren't thanks to monastics. But I feel we have made such a shift socially, particularly in modernity, from a pre-modern culture to that which is informed by the European Enlightenment, increasing secularity, individuation. The old monastic model, I think, is no longer really appropriate to the kind of culture that we find ourselves in now. But I think it's very dangerous to then somehow dismiss people becoming monks and nuns. Not at all. I'm very supportive of monastics. And I think I always will be. But I can no longer assume that they are the sort of central authority that effectively governs the whole Buddhist project.
Okay, thank you. We go to the next question. There are a lot of questions, so I won't get to them all, but the next one is, do you see the practice of questioning, very much linked to skepticism, as supporting practice for an ethics of uncertainty? Or do you see them in a different relationship, maybe even two shades of the same color?
Two shades of the same one?
Color.
Oh, color.
Spelled with a U.
Yeah, with a U, yeah, not that terrible.
Yeah, of course.
U. Yes, basically the practice of questioning, and I assume you're referring to the sort of Zen practice that I talk about in my writings, the question, what is this? And staying with that question. That's very much at the heart of an ethics of uncertainty. Because to be able to privilege questioning rather than belief puts you into an embodied state of not knowing. And again, this is the important term here is embodied. Many skeptical philosophers throughout history have questioned and doubted everything that can be doubted. But they've often treated this really as a kind of intellectual project, like Descartes, for example. Whereas I think what the Buddhist practice of questioning opens up is not just an intellectual inquiry, but actually an embodied investigation into the world that leads us much more into what we might think of as the experience of mystery, the experience of wonder, the experience of a not knowing, of an aporia, again, Socrates, in which we embrace the fact that we don't know. And that not knowing is not just not knowing certain facts about the nature of the world. I think the crucial thing here is recognizing that the real not knowing or confusion or ignorance, which are also synonyms, has to do with, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to respond. In other words, the ethics of uncertainty is founded on our ability to rest in this state of not knowing. And in Zen practice, if you pursue this kind of questioning, you discover quite early on that the mind doesn't like doing this. The mind would much rather have something to hold on to, some belief, some view, some opinion. And when you start doing this sort of practice, what is this, for example, quite spontaneously, all kinds of clever answers will spring into your mind. But the practice is, in a way, is about, in a sense, burning off that habit to hold on to a view, a position, and to consciously valorize the experience of not knowing. Keats called it negative capability. It's this capacity to be fully grounded in a non-opinionated, wondering openness that, paradoxically perhaps, I think provides us with an opening to our own deepest intuitions, sensibilities that can help inform in a less conceptual way what is the appropriate response to this situation I'm finding myself in now.
Okay, one more question. I'm intrigued with the similarity between your ethics of uncertainty and traditional Judaism's teaching that clear faith in the Abrahamic deity is less important than ethical behavior, as Judaism defines it. Do you see any cross-pollination between rabbinic Judaism, Socrates, Buddhism, and your own thinking?
I agree with the questioner in that there is, I think, a very good synergy between Jewish practice, which is really more a practice of ethics and how to live in this world. Again, in Judaic tradition, you don't have a very strong idea of what happens after death or where you came from. It's about how to live fully in this world. And I've always been very moved and inspired by that dimension of the Judaic tradition. But as far as I'm aware, there is no cross-pollination any more than there is between Buddhists and Socratics. I think it's extremely unlikely. We can't know for sure because we just don't have the data. But there doesn't appear to be in any of the written traditions of any of those three traditions ideas that we can't, the ideas that we cannot derive from antecedents within those particular traditions. And so when you see similarities between, say, rabbinical Judaism, certain forms of Buddhism, certain forms of Greek philosophy, I think it's more likely that they are saying something very similar because they're addressing similar human questions in similar human situations. And we are all, of course, anatomically identical, our brains and so forth, our ways of organizing society, that we come up with similar insights. I think and Buddhism has always recognized this, the idea of the solitary Buddha, the Pacceka Buddha, the idea that when there's not an actual world teacher like Gautama, Shakyamuni, then there still are many people all over the world who had no encounters with Buddhism, and yet they gain the same quality of awakening and insight as Buddhists do, because of their own temperament, their own predilection of examining their lives in a very similar way. That, I think, is more, to me, a more satisfying explanation for these parallels, rather than positing borrowing or cross-pollination.
Okay, I'm going to allow for one lightning round question. You have 10 seconds, Stephen. Is there an alternative word for Dharma?
I'm afraid there's not.
Okay, very good. That was within 10 seconds. Okay, I just want to say thank you to our listeners and thank you to Stephen. My colleague Danya Spencer will post information about the seminar again. I'm going to take it myself. And thank you, Stephen. Anything else to say before we leave?
Well, I hope that this discussion has raised your interest in perhaps participating in these seminars, these 12 seminars, starting in February, ending in June. There'll be 2 semesters, a break in the middle of about a month. And I would look forward very much to being able to explore these topics further. It will be a great opportunity for doing that. 3-hour sessions. There'll be also, hopefully, study groups organized amongst you as well that'll take place online. And other than that, I wish you all the very best.
Thank you. Same to you and to our listeners.